and welcome to Long Live the Queen, where we talk about the women who made history. And by we, I mean the royal we, because it's just me. This week, our subject is Queen Mary I. Mary was born on the 18th of February, 1516, just a few days after Valentine's Day. And Tudor England did celebrate the Day of Love. Valentine's Day existed hundreds of years before Hallmark did. Mary was the only child of King Henry VIII and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, to survive infancy. Her mother had suffered many miscarriages and stillbirths. Before Mary's birth, 4 previous pregnancies had resulted in a stillborn daughter and 3 short-lived or stillborn sons, including Henry, Duke of Cornwall, who lived for less than 2 months. Mary was baptized into the Catholic faith at the Church of the Observant Friars in Greenwich, 3 days after her birth. Her godparents included Lord Chancellor Thomas Wolsey, her great-aunt Catherine, Countess of Devon, who was the younger sister of Elizabeth of York and the daughter of Elizabeth Woodville, and Agnes Howard, Duchess of Norfolk, the step-grandmother from the Catherine Howard episode, and Henry VIII's first cousin once removed, Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, who also has her own episode. They stood sponsor for Mary's confirmation, which was conducted immediately after her baptism. The following year, Mary became a godmother herself when she was named as one of the sponsors of her cousin, Frances Brandon. This little baby Frances would grow up to be the mother of Lady Jane Grey from our last episode. In 1520, the Countess of Salisbury was appointed Mary's governess. That is Margaret Plantagenet Pole, for anyone who has or wants to listen to her episode. Mary was a precocious child. In July 1520, when scarcely 4.5 years old, she entertained a visiting French delegation with a performance on the virginals, which is a type of harpsichord. A great part of her early education came from her mother, Catherine of Aragon. If you listened to her episode, you probably heard that her royal education was extremely comprehensive. By the age of 9, Mary could read and write Latin. She studied French, Spanish, music, dance, and perhaps Greek. Henry VIII doted on his daughter, and once boasted to the Venetian ambassador that Mary never cried. Mary had a fair complexion, with pale blue eyes, and a red or reddish golden hair color, traits very similar to those of her parents. She was ruddy-cheeked, a trait she had inherited from her father. Despite his affection for Mary, Henry was deeply disappointed that his marriage had produced no sons. By the time Mary was 9 years old, it was apparent that Henry and Catherine would have no more children, leaving Henry without a legitimate male heir. In 1525, Henry sent Mary to the border of Wales to preside, presumably in name only, over the Council of Wales and the Marches. She was given her own court, based at Ludlow Castle, and many of the royal prerogatives normally reserved for a Prince of Wales. Mary was being trained to rule England, but England had never had a woman successfully reign on her own. She was called the Princess of Wales, although she was never technically invested with that title. She appears to have spent 3 years in the Welsh Marches, making regular visits to her father's court before returning permanently to the home counties around London in mid-1528 when she was about 12. Throughout Mary's childhood, Henry negotiated potential future marriages for her. When she was only 2 years old, Mary was promised to Francis, Dauphin of France, the infant son of King Francois I. This marriage would have made her the future Queen of France, but the contract was repudiated after 3 years. In 1522, at the age of 6, she was instead contracted to marry her 22-year-old cousin, Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. However, Charles broke off the engagement within a few years with Henry's agreement. That was probably a great idea. Charles V was her cousin, who was fairly inbred. He had acquired a birth defect known as the Habsburg jaw. His jaw was extraordinarily large, leading to health problems later in life. Cardinal Wolsey, Henry's chief advisor, then resumed marriage negotiations with the French, and Henry suggested that Mary marry the French king Francois I, who was eager for an alliance with England. A marriage treaty was signed, which provided Mary marry either Francois I or his second son, Henri, Duke of Orleans. But Wolsey secured an alliance with France without the marriage. In 1528, Wolsey's agent, Thomas Magnus, discussed the idea of her marriage to her cousin James V of Scotland. By this time, Mary was said to be developing into a pretty, well-proportioned young lady with a fine complexion. Although various possibilities for Mary's marriage had been considered, the marriage of Mary's parents was itself in jeopardy, which threatened her status. Disappointed at the lack of a male heir, and eager to remarry, Henry attempted to have his marriage to Queen Catherine annulled, but Pope Clement VII refused this request. Mary's cousin Charles, the Holy Roman Emperor, had sacked Rome and had possession of the Pope. The Pope was always going to side with Queen Catherine. Henry claimed, citing biblical passages, Leviticus 20:21, that the marriage was unclean because Catherine was the widow of his brother, Arthur, Prince of Wales, Princess Mary's uncle. Catherine claimed that her marriage to Arthur was never consummated, and so was not a valid marriage. Pope Julius II had issued a dispensation on that very basis. Clement VII may have been reluctant to act because he was influenced by Charles V, Catherine's nephew and Mary's former betrothed, whose troops had surrounded and occupied Rome in the War of the League of Cognac. From 1531, Mary was often sick with irregular menstruation and depression, although it's not clear whether this was caused by stress, puberty, or a more deep-seated disease. She was not permitted to see her mother, whom Henry had sent to live away from court. In early 1533, Henry married Anne Boleyn, and in May, Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, formally declared that the marriage with Catherine was void, and the marriage to Anne was valid. Henry repudiated the Pope's authority, declaring himself supreme head of the Church of England. Catherine was demoted to Dowager Princess of Wales, a title she would have held as Arthur's widow, and Mary was deemed illegitimate. She was styled the Lady Mary rather than Princess Mary, and her place in the line of succession was transferred to Henry and Anne's newborn daughter, Princess Elizabeth. Mary's household was dissolved. Her servants, including the Countess of Salisbury, were dismissed, and in December 1533, she was sent to join her infant half-sister's household. Mary determinedly refused to acknowledge that Anne was the queen, or that Elizabeth was a princess, further enraging King Henry. She was an unhappy teenager, and she had reason to be. Under strain, and with her movements restricted, Mary was frequently ill, which the royal physician attributed to her ill treatment. He was like, yeah, she's not doing well, but she's not being treated well. The imperial ambassador, Eustace Chapuis, became her close advisor and interceded unsuccessfully on her behalf at court. The relationship between Mary and her father worsened. They did not speak to each other for 3 years. Although both she and her mother were ill, Mary was refused permission to visit Catherine. When Catherine died in 1536, Mary was inconsolable. Catherine was interred in Peterborough Cathedral, while Mary grieved in semi-seclusion. Later that same year, Queen Anne fell from the king's favor as well, and she was beheaded. Elizabeth, like Mary, was declared illegitimate and stripped of her succession rights. Unlike Mary, Elizabeth was only 2 when she fell out of favor with her father. Mary could remember when their father had been loving. Elizabeth couldn't. Within 2 weeks of Anne's execution, Henry married Jane Seymour, who urged her husband to make peace with Mary. Henry insisted that Mary recognize him as head of the Church of England, repudiate papal authority, acknowledge that the marriage between her parents was unlawful, and accept her own illegitimacy. She attempted to reconcile with Henry by submitting to his authority, as far as God and my conscience allows, but eventually was bullied into signing a document agreeing to all of Henry's demands, going against everything she believed as a devout Catholic, but allowing her to regain her relationship with her father. Reconciled with her father, Mary resumed her place at court. Henry granted her a household, which included the reinstatement of Mary's friends. Mary's expenses included fine clothes and gambling at cards, one of her favorite pastimes. Rebels in the north of England, including Lord Hussey, Mary's former chamberlain, campaigned against Henry's religious reforms, and one of their demands was that Mary be made legitimate. The rebellion, known as the Pilgrimage of Grace, was ruthlessly suppressed, along with other rebels. Hussey was executed, but there is no suggestion that Mary was directly involved, though she was the person they were championing. In 1537, Queen Jane died after giving birth to a son, Edward. Mary was made godmother to her half-brother and acted as chief mourner at the Queen's funeral. Mary was courted by Philip, Duke of Bavaria, from late 1539, but he was Lutheran and she was still very, very Catholic. On the down low, though, because England was now under the Anglican Church of England. His suit for her hand was unsuccessful. When Mary was 26, the king's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, negotiated a potential alliance with the Duchy of Cleves. Suggestions that Mary William I, Duke of Cleves, who was the same age but also Protestant, came to nothing. But a match between Henry and the Duke's sister Anne was agreed upon. When the king saw Anne for the first time in late December, a week before the scheduled wedding, he found her unattractive, but was unable, for diplomatic and contractual reasons, and without a suitable pretext, to cancel the marriage. Cromwell fell from favor for setting up this blind date from hell and was arrested for treason in June the following year. One of the unlikely charges against him was that he had plotted to marry Princess Mary himself. Anne consented to the annulment of the marriage, which had not been consummated, and Cromwell was beheaded. In 1541, Henry had Margaret Pole, Mary's old governess and godmother, executed on the pretext of a Catholic plot, which her son Reginald Pole was implicated. Her executioner was a wretched and blundering youth who literally hacked her head and shoulders to pieces. In 1542, following the execution of Henry's fifth wife, Catherine Howard, the unmarried Henry invited Mary to attend royal Christmas festivities. At court, her father was between marriages and thus without a consort. Mary acted as hostess. In 1543, Henry married his sixth and last wife, Catherine Parr, one of Mary's ladies, who was able to bring the family closer together. Henry returned Mary and Elizabeth to the line of succession through the Act of Succession, 1544, also known as the Third Succession Act, because Henry loved changing the succession laws, placing his daughters after his son Edward, though both remained legally illegitimate. Henry VIII died in 1547, and his 9-year-old son Edward succeeded him as King Edward VI. The king is dead. Long live the king. Mary inherited estates in Norfolk, Suffolk, and Essex. Since Edward was still a child, rule passed to a regency council dominated by Protestants who attempted to establish their faith throughout the country. For example, the Act of Uniformity, 1549, prescribed Protestant rites for the church services, such as the use of Thomas Cranmer's Book of Common Prayer. Mary remained faithful to the Roman Catholic Church and defiantly celebrated traditional Mass in her own chapel. She appealed to her cousin, Emperor Charles V, to apply diplomatic pressure demanding that she be allowed to practice her religion. For most of Edward's reign, Mary remained on her own estates and rarely attended court. A plan between May and July 1550 to smuggle her out of England to the safety of the European mainland came to nothing. Religious differences between Mary and Edward continued. Mary attended a reunion with Edward and Elizabeth for Christmas, 1550, where the 13-year-old Edward embarrassed Mary, who was then 34, and reduced both her and himself to tears in front of the court by publicly reprimanding her for ignoring his laws regarding worship, something he was likely encouraged to do by his advisors. Mary repeatedly refused Edward's demands that she abandon Catholicism, and Edward persistently refused to drop his demands. On the 6th of July, 1553, at the age of 15, King Edward VI died of a lung infection, possibly tuberculosis. He did not want the crown to go to his sister Mary because he feared she would restore Catholicism and undo his and their father's reforms. and so he planned to exclude her from the line of succession. His advisors told him that he could not disinherit only one of his half-sisters. He would have to disinherit Elizabeth as well, even though she was a Protestant. Guided by John Dudley, 1st Duke of Northumberland, and perhaps others, Edward excluded both of his sisters from the line of succession in his will, contradicting the Act of Succession, 1544, which had restored Mary and Elizabeth to the line of succession. Edward named Dudley's daughter-in-law, Lady Jane Grey, the granddaughter of Henry VIII's younger sister Mary, as his successor. Lady Jane's mother was Frances Brandon, Mary's cousin and goddaughter. Just before Edward's death, Mary was summoned to London to visit her dying brother, but was warned that the summons was a pretext on which to capture her and thereby facilitate Jane's accession to the throne. If they had Mary held captive, she couldn't fight for the throne. Therefore, instead of heading to London from her residence, Mary fled to East Anglia, where she owned extensive estates and had much support. On the 9th of July, from Kenninghall, Norfolk, she wrote to the Privy Council with orders for her proclamation as Edward's successor. The king is dead. Long live the queen. But who was the queen was kind of open for discussion. Would it be Edward's half-sister, the daughter of King Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, or the daughter of King Edward's cousin, Lady Jane Grey? On the 10th of July, 1553, Lady Jane was proclaimed queen by the mostly Protestant Privy Council, and on the same day, Mary's letter to the council arrived in London. By the 12th of July, Mary and her supporters had assembled a military force at Framlingham Castle, Suffolk. Northumberland's support collapsed, and Jane was deposed on the 19th of July. She had been claiming to be queen, and she, her husband, and other conspirators were imprisoned in the Tower of London. Mary rode triumphantly into London in August on a wave of popular support. She was accompanied by her half-sister Elizabeth and a procession of over 800 nobles and gentlemen. Not supporting her would be a fatal mistake. The Privy Council had misread the feelings of the English people. Lady Jane Grey was known as the 9 Days Queen, but she was never uncontested. So Queen Mary I became the first undisputed Queen Regnant of England. The king is dead. Long live the queen. One of Mary's first actions as queen was to order the release of the Roman Catholic supporters of her, held in the Tower. Mary understood that the young Lady Jane was essentially a pawn of Northumberland's scheme, and Northumberland was the only conspirator of rank executed for high treason in the immediate aftermath of the attempted coup. Lady Jane and her husband, Lord Guildford Dudley, though, they were found guilty, but they were kept under guard in the Tower rather than immediately executed, while Lady Jane's father, Henry Grey, 1st Duke of Suffolk, was released. Mary was left in a difficult position, as almost all the Privy Councillors had been implicated in the plot to put Lady Jane on the throne. She appointed Gardiner to the council and made him both Bishop of Winchester and Lord Chancellor, offices held until his death in November 1555. Mary's friend and lady-in-waiting, Susan, became Mistress of the Robes. On the 1st of October, 1553, Mary was crowned at Westminster Abbey, Queen Mary I. She was now aged 37, and she turned her attention to finding a husband and producing an heir, which would prevent the Protestant Elizabeth, still next in line under the terms of Henry VIII's will and the Act of Succession of 1544, from succeeding the throne. Edward Courtenay and Reginald Pole were both mentioned as prospective suitors, but her first cousin Charles V suggested that she marry his only legitimate son, Philip. Was it awkward to marry the son of your cousin, the same cousin she had been once betrothed to? It had to be. But that's also what they did then, so maybe not? It was kind of normal then for royalty. The Spanish prince had been widowed a few years before by the death of his first wife, Maria Manuela of Portugal, mother of his son Carlos, and was the heir apparent to the vast territories in continental Europe and the New World. Both Philip and Mary were descendants of John of Gaunt, and, in Mary's case, the ancestry was by double lineage. As part of the marriage negotiations, a portrait of Philip was sent to Mary. in the latter half of 1553. If they married and had a child, that child would be heir to the throne of England and a half-sibling to the future King of Spain. So maybe they would have built a family alliance. Lord Chancellor Gardiner and the English House of Commons unsuccessfully petitioned Mary to consider marrying an Englishman, fearing that England would be relegated to dependency of the Habsburgs. They weren't interested in becoming the junior partner of Spain, who at that time was the stronger country. The marriage was unpopular with the English. Gardiner and his allies opposed it on the basis of patriotism, while Protestants were motivated by a fear of Catholicism. If very Catholic Mary and very Catholic Philip had a baby, that baby would probably be very, very Catholic. You can share your thoughts with me at longlivethequeenpodcast@gmail.com or on Facebook or Instagram at Long Live the Queen Podcast, or simply share it with a friend. Long live to all the queens out there, and until next week, bye.
Will be remembered.
Thanks for listening.